You know how life has ups and downs? Well, the devils have very particular strategies to use on us in the middle of the trials and the tribulations. And that's what this letter is about. The particular difficulty with which the patient is contending is the bombing of London in World War II. But the strategies Screwtape articulates are the same ones that they use on us today, when things get really serious.
My dear Wormwood, now that it is certain that the German humans will bombard your patient's town, and that his duties will keep him in the thick of the danger, we must consider our policy. Are we to aim at cowardice or at courage, with consequent pride, or at hatred of the Germans?
Again, it's interesting that the devils can of course use vices against us, but they can also use our virtues. Courage is good, but it can also be a source of pride. So we need to keep that in mind. But virtues are generally problematic for the devils, because heaven is the source of all the virtues.
Well, I am afraid it is no good trying to make him brave. Our research department has not yet discovered, though success is hourly expected, how to produce any virtue. This is a serious handicap. To be greatly and effectively wicked, a man needs some virtue. What would Attila have been without his courage, or Shylock without self-denial as regards the flesh? But we cannot supply these qualities ourselves. We can only use them as supplied by the enemy, and this means leaving him a kind of foothold in those men whom otherwise we have made most securely our own. A very unsatisfactory arrangement, but I trust we shall one day learn to do better.
So to use courage against us when times get really tough is problematic for the forces of hell. But hatred has promise. In the context of the letter, it is hatred for the Germans. In our day, it seems that there is no shortage of people to hate, so the devils must be having a heyday.
Hatred we can manage. The tension of human nerves during noise, danger, and fatigue makes them prone to any violent emotion, and it is only a question of guiding this susceptibility into the right channels. If conscience resists, muddle him. Let him say that he feels hatred not on his own behalf, but on that of the women and the children, and that a Christian is told to forgive his own, not other people's enemies. In other words, let him consider himself sufficiently identified with the women and children to feel hatred on their behalf, but not sufficiently identified to regard their enemies as his own, and therefore proper objects of forgiveness.
Screwtape once again returns to the theme of muddling human thinking. The Christian patient knows that we are expected to forgive, even our enemies. But we can somehow give ourselves a pass with hating our enemies if we can take it out of a personal hatred. We hate them because of our love for others, and then somehow our hatred seems to be good. I don't have to think for a minute of the groups of people that are objects of this loving hatred in our world today. In very general terms, you know who the conservatives hate and who the liberals hate. On the behalf of others, of course.
But hatred is best combined with fear. Cowardice, alone of all the vices, is purely painful, horrible to anticipate, horrible to feel, horrible to remember. Hatred has its pleasures. It is therefore often the compensation by which a frightened man reimburses himself for the miseries of fear. The more he fears, the more he will hate. And hatred is also a great anodyne for shame. To make a deep wound in his charity, you should therefore first defeat his courage.
So the devils like to compromise our courage by blending it with hatred. But hatred gives the hater a bit of pleasure, and that's a downside for the devils. That's why they like working with cowardice a lot better, because there's no pleasure at all in cowardice. You see, to escape self-loathing, the coward will turn toward hate. Hate for the thing they fear. And they get that little bit of pleasure from the hate as a bit of a balm for their shame. But this strategy isn't a silver bullet either. Cowardice comes with its own unique problems.
Now this is a ticklish business. We have made men proud of most vices, but not of cowardice. Whenever we have almost succeeded in doing so, the enemy permits a war or an earthquake or some other calamity, and at once courage becomes so obviously lovely and important even in human eyes that all our work is undone, and there is still at least one vice of which they feel genuine shame. The danger of inducing cowardice in our patients, therefore, is lest we produce real self-knowledge and self-loathing with consequent repentance and humility.
You see how hard it is for the forces of hell? Even cowardice can turn us toward God. Screwtape admits that if we were to come face to face with the shame that comes from cowardice, there's a good chance we would end up turning to God in humility and repentance.
And in fact, in the last war, thousands of humans, by discovering their own cowardice, discovered the whole moral world for the first time. In peace, we can make many of them ignore good and evil entirely. In danger, the issue is forced upon them in a guise to which even we cannot blind them.
Many of us who live in North America have not experienced anything equivalent to the world wars of the last century. In fact, even in Europe, most of the people younger than I haven't even been raised by people who went through a war. Don't get me wrong, this is great for us. But perhaps one of the reasons so many people in our culture have lost any sense of the moral world is that most have not experienced any actual danger. Screwtape continues.
There is here a cruel dilemma before us. If we promoted justice and charity among men, we should be playing directly into the enemy's hands. But if we guide them to the opposite behavior, this sooner or later produces, for he permits it to produce, a war or a revolution, and the undistinguishable issue of cowardice or courage awakens thousands of men from moral stupor.
Have you ever wondered why God created the world the way it is? A world that's filled with all kinds of things that can threaten our well-being and our livelihood? This is one of the biggest reasons that people have for rejecting the idea of a good God. But perhaps there's something else going on here. Screwtape continues.
This, indeed, is probably one of the enemy's motives for creating a dangerous world. A world in which moral issues really come to the point. He sees as well as you do that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. A chastity or honesty or mercy which yields to danger will be chaste or honest or merciful only on conditions. Pilate was merciful till it became risky. It is therefore possible to lose as much as we gain by making your man a coward. He may learn too much about himself.
Did you catch that? Courage isn't like the other virtues. Courage is the form of every virtue at the testing point. This might be the reason that life in this world is made up of testing points. And this is why there is such a danger in making the patient a coward in the middle of dangerous circumstances. But there is a potential positive side, positive for the devils, of exposing his cowardice. Remember how courage is a bit of a super virtue? It may also be true that cowardice is a super vice.
There is, of course, always the chance, not of chloroforming the shame, but of aggravating it and producing despair. This would be a great triumph. It would show that he had believed in and accepted the enemy's forgiveness of his other sins, only because he himself did not fully feel their sinfulness. That in respect to the one vice which he really understands in its full depth of dishonor, he cannot seek nor credit the mercy.
The devils love despair. It's interesting that cowardice can bring us to despair like no other sin, and that's because we feel less sinful with the other sins. This is of course silly, but cowardice more than any other sin has us feeling like we are beyond God's forgiveness. We are of course never outside of God's forgiveness, but we don't feel that way with cowardice, and so we despair.
But I fear you have already let him get too far in the enemy's school, and he knows that despair is a greater sin than any of the sins which provoke it.
He then gets into some of the nitty-gritty of a very subtle form of cowardice. It undermines and distracts us from our duty.
As to the actual technique of temptations to cowardice, not much need to be said. The main point is that precautions have a tendency to increase fear. The precautions publicly enjoined on your patient, however, soon become a matter of routine, and this effect disappears. What you must do is to keep running his mind side by side with the conscious intention of doing his duty, the vague idea of all sorts of things he can do or not do inside the framework of the duty, which seems to make him a little safer. Get his mind off the simple truth, I've got to stay here and do so-and-so, into a series of imaginary lifelines. If A happened, though I very much hope it wouldn't, I could do B, and if the worst came to the worst, I could always do C. Superstitions, if not recognized as such, can be awakened. The point is to keep him feeling that he has something, other than the enemy and the courage of the enemy's supplies, to fall back on, so that what was intended to be total commitment to duty becomes honeycombed all through with little unconscious reservations.
It is again the devil's strategy to get us all muddled in the head and distract us from the simple truth. This is my duty, and I will do it, come what may. What role does duty actually play in our lives these days? It seems to me that nowadays, if we think in terms of duty at all, our thoughts are full of conditions. I will certainly do my duty if he has done this and not done that, if she has said this or not said that, if I have time, if I feel like it. Anyway, it's fairly simple. We have duties and we are expected to fulfill them, come what may. The devils would have us working out all kinds of contingency plans that have us trying to fulfill our duty and avoid any of the negative consequences of our doing so. Screwtape's last line is worth noting.
For remember, the act of cowardice is all that matters. The emotion of fear is in itself no sin, and though we enjoy it, does us no good.
This is something that my children often say to my grandchildren. It's okay for you to feel angry or frustrated, but it's not okay to hit your brother. Feelings are not sinful in and of themselves. It's how we act upon them that matters. In Screwtape's 30th letter, he laments Wormwood's failure as the patient faces death with courage and faith, ultimately escaping their clutches. Thank you, and we'll see you there.